A History of the Civil Rights Movement.
Brought to you by
the Black Student Union.
The Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was a black civil rights group founded in 1905 near Niagara Falls. Scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois gathered with supporters on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls to form an organization dedicated to social and political change for African Americans. His list of demands including an end to segregation and discrimination in unions, the courts, and public accommodations, as well as equality of economic and educational opportunity. Although the Niagara Movement had little impact on legislative action, its ideals led to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP, in 1909. On February 12, 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded by a multiracial group of activists who answered the call in New York City, New York. They initially called themselves the National Negro Committee. The founders included the likes of Ida B. Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Moskowitz, Mary White Ovington, Oswald and Garrison Villiard, William English Walling, led the call to renew the struggle for civil and political liberty. They were a multiracial group, prominent black leaders and co-conspirators. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a journalist and anti-lynching activist known for documenting lynching in the United States in articles and through her pamphlet called Southern Horrors. W.E.B. Du Bois was born February 23, 1868. He was an American sociologist, socialist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, author, writer, and editor. He rose to national prominence as a leader of the Niagara Movement, a group of African American activists that wanted equal rights for blacks. Mary White Ovington, born April 11, 1865 in Brooklyn, New York, deceased July 15, 1951. A suffrage, socialist, Unitarian journalist, and co-founder of the NAACP. Henry Moskowitz was born on September 27, 1880 in Husi, Romania. He was Jewish. He migrated to the United States in 1883 and was a civil rights activist and one of the co-founders of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. Oswald Garrison Villiard, born March 13, 1872, and died October 1, 1949. He was an American journalist and editor of the New York Evening Post. He was a civil rights activist, and along with his mother, Fanny Villiard, a founding member of the NAACP. William English Walling, born 1877, died in 1936. Known as English to his friends and family, he founded the National Women's Trade Union League in 1903. Moved by his investigation of the Springfield race riot of 1908 in the state capital of Illinois, he was among the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. Civil rights leaders fought for anti-lynching laws. The Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill was first introduced in 1918 by Representatives Leonidas C. Dyer, a Republican from St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States House of Representatives as H.R. 11279. It was intended to establish lynching as a federal crime. Anti-Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in southern United States. Anti-Grandfather Clause. The Grandfather Clause was a legal or constitutional mechanism passed by 7 southern states during Reconstruction to deny suffrage to blacks. It meant that those who had enjoyed the right to vote prior to 1867 or their lineal descendants would be exempt from educational, property, or tax requirements for voting. Anti-Black Codes. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. Though the Union victory had given some 4 million slaves their freedom, the question of freed blacks' status in the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states required blacks to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, or forced into unpaid labor. Anti-redlining. Started in the 1930s, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and Homeowners Loan Corporation conspired to create maps with marked areas considered bad risk for mortgages and a practice known as redlining. The areas marked in red as hazardous typically outlined black neighborhoods. This kind of mapping concentrated poverty as mostly black. Residents in red line neighborhoods had no access or only very expensive access to loans. The NAACP has been beneficial in combating race-based discrimination since its creation. The March on Washington. The NAACP co-organized the march in 1963. This is the site where Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech. In 1964, the NAACP lobbied for the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also prohibits discrimination in public accommodation on federally funded programs. In the summer of 1963, President Kennedy asked Congress for the Civil Rights Bill, but before they could go any further with it, he was assassinated. Then President Johnson, with the help of Roy Wilkins and Clarence Mitchell, they were able to secure the bill. Once the bill was signed and in act, desegregation and voting rights were being enforced nationally. This bill was the start of the end of the Jim Crow laws and the beginning of a new era of freedom and happiness. In 1965, the NAACP lobbied for voting rights, which made it illegal to deny people the right to vote based on their race. Additional civil rights leaders include Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a prominent activist, author, and public speaker. He became a leader in the abolitionist movement, which sought to end the practice of slavery before and during the Civil War. U.S. Congressional Representative Barbara Jordan from Texas was the first African-American congresswoman to come from the Deep South. The Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, otherwise known as the UNIA, represented the largest mass movement in African-American history. The organization was also responsible for creating the red, black, and green flag for Black unity. Shirley Anita Chisholm was an American politician, educator, and author. In 1968, she became the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress. A. Philip Randolph, born April 15, 1889, deceased May 16, 1979, was a civil rights leader and activist. In 1925, he had organized and led the Brotherhood Sleeping Car Porters, which was the first labor organization that was led by an African American. Martin Luther King Jr. even called A. Philip Randolph truly the Dean of Negro Leaders. To date, A. Philip Randolph is the only American who's been able to live through the Garvey movement as well as the Civil Rights Movement. Mrs. Dorothy Irene Height was an American civil rights and women's rights activist. She focused on the issues of African American women, including unemployment, illiteracy, and voter awareness. Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist who served as the first state field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi until his unfortunate assassination in 1963. Fannie Lou Hamer was an American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, and leader in the civil rights movement. She was the co-founder and vice chair of the Freedom Democratic Party. Mr. Paul Robeson was an acclaimed 20th century performer known for productions like The Emperor Jones and Othello. He was also an international activist. Miss Stacey Yvonne Abrams is an American politician, lawyer, voting rights activist, and author who served in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2007 to 2017, serving as minority leader from 2011 to 2017. Bayard Rustin, an unsung hero in American history, was a civil rights organizer and activist, best known for his work as advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s. Little known fact about Bayard Rustin, he was also the co-writer of Dr. King's iconic I Have a Dream speech. Mrs. Coretta Scott King, born April 27, 1927, died on January 30, 2006, was the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King, an American author, activist, civil rights leader, and an advocate for African American equality. She was a leader for the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And last but not least, the Honorable Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., born January 15, 1929, to his death in 1968, the most known civil rights leader in the United States of America.